All right, shalom, shalom, family. Shabbat shalom. Welcome back, welcome back. It's your fellow brother, Will, son of Yah. And as you can tell by the title today, we will be getting to a reading of the Black Jews of Harlem, Representation, Identity, and Race. Now, we won't be reading through this whole journal, but what I will do is give you all the link to the journal so you all can read the whole thing if you would like. But what we will be doing today is going through the highlights, all right? Some of the key parts and some of the key mentions, all right, that goes into the history of black Jews in America, what white Americans feel about them, and even what other American Jews feel about these black Jews within America. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I hope you all enjoy the read. Again, The Black Jews of Harlem, Representation, Identity, and Race. Roberta S. Gold, University of Washington. All right. And the official introduction starts right here at the bottom paragraph. What reads off. In the early decades of the 20th century, there appeared in New York and other American cities a set of unusual religious congregations which came to be known as Black Jews. African in ancestry, Jewish in faith, these groups claimed to be the direct and true heirs of ancient Israel. Although they did not forge strong ties with the wider African American or Jewish communities, they drew steady interest from both minority community newspapers. Coverage in the black and Jewish press, however, differed markedly. White Jewish journalists often viewed sex with incredulity or amusement, like the Sun's jocular butcher. Jewish observers marveled that the real Negro people might call themselves Jews. By contrast, black papers such as the Afro-American have far less to say. They reported matter-of-factly on the tenure of Rabbi Matthew and other black Jewish leaders and provided a tolerant forum for their views on religious and racial uplift. These differing journalistic attitudes reflected discrepancies between black and Jewish discourses of identity in the early 20th century. Jews during the interwar years were caught up in a struggle over racial definitions, one themselves and other groups, the outcome of which would bear heavily on the ability to move up the American social ladder. They faced a basic question: whether Jews, long depicted as dark and different people, were a distinct or white race. This issue raised mixed feelings that Jews played out in several venues, including the Yiddish press, which reported frequently on anti-black racism and argued that African Americans were in effect American Jews. African Americans, for their part, drew on long theological and nationalistic traditions, which identified black history with that of biblical Israelites. Moreover, black leaders of the early 20th century consistently pointed to Jewish immigrants as examples of communal, upwardly, mobile capitalists whom African Americans should emulate. Thus, both African American and Jewish Americans bore traditions of thought linking black and Jew, and both found in Harlem's black Jews the unexpected embodiment of what had traditionally been metaphoric linkage. However, because the metaphor of black Jews had served different functions in the two groups, systems of religious and political beliefs and incarnation in black Jewish congregations played differently in these two community presses. This article argues that in white Jewish discourse, the figure of the black Jews was usefully precise because it was a metaphor not meant to be taken literally, and was thus an indirect way of claiming American Jews' attainment of white racial status. Hence, the discovery of a real black people claiming Jewishness was an unsettling event, provoking laughter and dismissal. In African American thought, by contrast, black Jewish identification was part of a spectrum of religious and political identities that did not rely on implicity distinctions between blacks and Jews or exclusionary racial categories more generally. As a consequence, the African American community could receive the sect with greater tolerance and solidarity. The reportage, however, also reflects sometimes or something more than disparate discourses within black and Jewish communities. In the 1920s and 1930s, African and Jewish Americans did not just inhabit different discursive areas, they inhabited different social locations. In other words, not only did they have different ways of talking about and perceiving the world, they generally had unequal accesses to economic, political, and cultural institutions that structured power relationships in the world. Both groups were marginalized minorities within American society, but Jews enjoyed substantially greater exercise of citizenship rights and economic mobility than did blacks. Moreover, the interwar years, precisely the time when black Jewish congregations achieved a consistent presence in Harlem, were a crucial period of transition in American ethno-racial ideology. When Jews were on the cusp of gaining still greater acceptance into the mainstream, blacks had no such opportunity at all at that time. Consequently, the practical stakes riding on racial interpretations of phenomena like the black Jews were significantly higher for Jews than for African Americans. Jews had more to lose from being linked with blacks, precisely because they had much to gain from being cast as whites. The fraught ambivalent quality of Jewish writings on black Jews compared with the relatively straightforward portrayals in the black press reflects the disparity in the social latitude available to the two groups during the 1920s and 1930s. Thus, Harlem's black Jews provided an unusual opportunity to study the interwar struggle over the racial definitions between their descriptions as both black and Jewish, placed them in an intersection of diverse changing and social consequential understanding of race. Drawing primarily on contemporaneous news accounts, this article begins by describing the black Jewish congregation that took form in the 1920s. It then turns to question the origin of identity, which many observers pose to the black Jews. It seeks to situate those questions within African American and Jewish ideologies and experiences. The African American setting includes traditional and 20th century religion, black nationalism, and Harlem's early 20th century millennium. These cultural traditions and circumstances resonated with black Jewish beliefs and hence made the congregations appear social and ideological situated to African American observers. By contrast, Jewish struggles over the nature of Jewish difference and the racial designation of Jews produced debates and ideological instabilities that made it difficult, even undesirable, for white Jews to accept black Jews as authentic. Because the black Jews chroniclers were informed by these powerful ideological frameworks, and because the black Jews articulated their own story in terms of divine casualty and meaning, there are limits to the authority one can claim in writing a secular history of their movement. All historical facts are contested, but the facts of black Judaism are particularly so. This article attempts a sketch of the modern black Jews using the tool historians apply to all documentary records, but it focuses on representations. It seeks to portray the black Jews, both African and Jewish projects, their concepts of what it meant to be a black or Jew. Juxtaposing those concepts help to clarify how the two groups viewed and wished to view themselves and each other. Seeing those identities in the context of changing racial arguments in turn helps us understand how racial discourse both shaped and reflected social powers in the years between the interwars. Modern black Jews appear. To trace the secular history of American black Jews is to follow a series of early sightings, which fed into a more sustained historical visibility. Near the turn of the 20th century, a trickle of reports began to record the appearance in New York area of black persons who presented themselves as Jews. In 1905, a Jewish paper noted, A Negro came to New York and asked for a ticket in poor Yiddish at a Jewish theater. The reporter questioned the man and learned that he was raised in the Jewish neighborhood and had assimilated a great deal from his neighbors. His everyday speech was Yiddish and only spoke English when he knew that his Yiddish would not be understood. The man kept all the Jewish holidays faithfully. 3 years later, a Negro named Samuel Johnson, detained in Newark County Jail, demanded mitzvah instead of Passover bread. Sam spoke Hebrew and could recite the entire Haggadah. He claimed to come originally from Jerusalem. Another wayfarer visited the heavily Ashkenazic Lower East Side around 1910 and drew considerable local interest. My father fetched a Negro to suffer, recalled Michael Gold in his autobiographical novel. The father reassured his wife, Katie, "Do not be frightened. This black man is one of us. He is an African Jew. I met him in a synagogue. Imagine he prays in Hebrew like the rest of us." The Gold's guest was welcome in for an evening of food and theological debate among the families and their fascinated neighbors. Such stories were sporadic. Into the 1920s, the news reports began to reflect a different kind of black Judaism. This movement took the form of all or mostly black congregates designated in racially specific terms. Negro Jews win in rent suit, announced Harlem's Amsterdam News in December of 1925. The story recounted a court victory by Beth Benai Abraham congregation, a colored Jewish group with headquarters at 459 Lenox Ave in Harlem. The leader, Rabbi Arnold Ford, comes from South America. To show his Hebraic training, he spoke in Yiddish to Justice Pankin. The following year, another congregation was portrayed more critically to be the law of the press. A Chicago Defender article on new horrors buried among black Jews revealed scandals within the Ever Live and Never Die group, a self-identified black Jewish sect. The group's leader, Elder W. Robinson, was convicted under the Mann Act, known ironically as the White Slavery Act, for maintaining a vast number of wives, daughters of wealthy Harlem residents who had been lured by the handsome, well-educated youth in his employ. But most news coverage was less sensational and it reflected the concern black Jews took themselves as central, which was a litigation but simply the practice of their faith. In a 1925 Jewish Daily Forward interview, a professor, Richelieu, who helped lead a Harlem synagogue of 200 members, spoke earnestly on the fidelity his community felt towards religious observance and learning. "We have spent priceless hours studying Bobar Kamar and Bobar Batra. We are familiar with the writings of Rashi and Rambam. We observe every Jewish holiday in every possible way. We try to live our lives as truly Jewish." Black papers regularly recounted the rhythms and rituals of black Jewish observance. An African American journal reported that the Moorish Temple ordained a new rabbi, Israel Ben Newman, at its Harlem quarter in 1929. The next fall, in subsequent years, Harlem papers noticed that the Commandment Keepers congregation welcomed Rosh Hashanah with ram's horn and prayer. The congregation would make a procession to the Harlem shore to observe the New Year's custom of Tashik, the symbolic casting away of sins upon the water. By the 1930s, at least 4 groups existed in Harlem. Extant descriptions allow only thick sketches of their histories and membership, but a few patterns do emerge. Several congregations took form in the early 1920s. 1921 was the year of incorporation reported for 2 groups, the Commandment Keepers and the Moorish Zionist Temple. Another, Beth Benai Abraham, began in 1923. The Ever Live Sick was said to have begun as early as 1917. It appeared under a new name, Gospel of the Kingdom, around 1931, when a news brief reported the death of his rabbi, Ishai Kaufman, from burns sustained in a fire at the temple building. Their total membership was small, In the 1930s, it probably never surpassed 1,000. Although claims varied and are difficult to access, more Zionists was found to be struggling in 1929, for movement cannot attract more than about 50 members, and the Commandment Keepers that year numbered 100. More information, or one informant told the New York Sun in 1929, in all they have around some 2,000, yet that figure is hard to support when the same reporter stated that he counted 3 synagogues, of which the 100-strong Commandment Keepers was a leader. The Commandment Keepers' own estimate rose to 200 by the 1931 and to 500 55 years later. The congregation also presented itself as the flagship of a larger movement. In 1931, the group told the Amsterdam News that its leader, Rabbi Matthew, is the chief overseer of a congregation of which there are already 12 branches scattered over this country and in the British West Indies. Like their numbers, the congregation gender class and ethnic composition can be glimpsed if not clearly seen. One visitor to the Commandment Keepers synagogue reported most of them were women, but the rabbis and other elders who were most prominent in the news stories were exclusively male. Moreover, photos from the 1930s onward document a substantial male presence at the service. Likewise, photos of the Talmud Torah classes show both boys and girls at study. These images and the group's own social teaching on the importance of stable, monogamous family units suggest a desire for conservative, structured community involving both men and women. Black Jews were consistently described as poor and working people, with many of the women, like non-Jewish black women, during the day employed as domestics. Yet, although poor, they managed to avoid the extreme destitution which threatened so many Harlemites. The Commandment Keepers, Rabbi Matthew, proudly told a journalist, not more than 3 or 4 black Jews have ever received public relief. Moreover, the synagogue members concisely pursue a strategy of communal economic uplift and petit bourgeois investment. By 1943, they had built up 50-odd business establishments that included cigar and stationery stores, tailor shops, laundries, a gas range repair shop, and restaurants serving kosher dishes. They patronized almost exclusively stores owned by Jews, whether white or Negro, and whether possibly black Jewish merchants employed Jews. Finally, an ethnic pattern appears among Harlem's black Jews. The leadership and the congregants were markedly West Indian or otherwise foreign-born. Most of them come from East Africa or South America, observe an early report on Beth Benai Abraham. Arnold Ford, the congregation rabbi, was educated in Barbados, South America, and Bermuda. The Samuel Valentine family, which affiliated early on with Ford's congregation, and later saw a daughter, Vertella, serve as valedictorian of the institutional synagogue Talmudic Torah class, had immigrated from Jamaica. Morris Zionist professor Richelieu traced much of his congregation to Eastern countries. There are a number of Yemen Jews, Moroccan Jews, Egyptian Jews, Abyssinian Jews, about 200 all told. Richelieu was born in Cairo, Egypt. Rabbi Hermes comes from Morocco. A more exclusive history surrounding Rabbi Winford A. Matthew, the Commandment Keeper leader and the black Jew most often interviewed. He was variously said to hail from Sierra Leone, Lagos, and Ethiopia. Interviewers agree, however, that Matthew, like many others, had spent time in the West Indies before migrating or immigrating to New York. So where do they come from? What exactly were the geographical origins of the black Jews? This was a question that came up repeatedly in news articles and in which reporters and black Jews themselves appear to have investigated much significance. However, this investment varied among different parties. For congregants, the question touched on a tenet that was central to their faith: the link between blackness and Jewish identity. Adherents of the Harlem movement did not see their black Jewish status such as a coincidental intersection of two independent social categories. That is, they were simply Jews who happened to also be black, or vice versa. Rather, their dual identity comprehended a single truth: the black man is a Jew. This belief was articulated most clearly by the Commandment Keepers, Rabbi Matthew. He explained that he explained the exegetical reasoning behind the principle that the black man is a direct lineal descendant of Abraham, Isaac, son of Abraham, was the father of Esau, whose skin was hairy like the white man's, and Jacob, whose skin was smooth like the black man's. Jacob's descendant, Solomon, mated with the Queen of Sheba, who returned to Africa, where she bore him a son known in biblical history as Menelik I. From Menelik sprang the line of kings who ruled continuously in Ethiopia for 3,000 odd years. There has been an unbroken succession to Haile Selassie. Hence, all genuine Jews are black then, or black men. Leaders of other groups also took this Jewishness of blacks as foundational. This belief was exalted in a song, Ethiopia, Land of Israel, which to black Jews was just as important and popular as the Hikvok song among the white Jews. The lyrics ran in part, "The truth is that we are Jews. 3 tribes of Israel were lost. They were away in the wilderness of Africa. The children of Israel, Jews are you now, and Jews were you before. Time has not changed your blood." This vision, a Solomonic ancestor, was not unique to the black Jewish congregation. It circulated within a wider tradition of African diasporic thought known as Ethiopianism, which drew on both biblical references to Ethiopian and modern East African anti-colonialism to find in Ethiopia a symbol of black dignity and freedom. The tradition spread widely among enslaved and free blacks in North America and the Caribbean by the late 18th century. It gained further resonance with the Western discovery of Ethiopian Jews known as the Philosophes in the 18th and 19th centuries, and with the chronic of Haile Selassie and the Ethiopian battle against the Italian forces in the 1930s. But if Ethiopianism's stories of Solomon and Sheba was current among many in the black diaspora, it was especially central to the religious experience of black Harlem's Jews. Indeed, in 1930, Rabbi Arnold Ford traveled to Ethiopia to attend Haile Selassie's coronation and stayed in effort to found a permanent black Jewish colony near the Falasha territory. 60 American congregants eventually followed him, but the colony failed, and Ford died shortly thereafter, to be replaced in New York by Rabbi Matthew. The Solomonic tradition remained vital among Harlem congregants. Its repetition and lingering in song indicates the congregants found it spiritually compelling. The story helped to secure religious identity within the framework of faith Judaism that treated lineage as a criterion of membership. For believers in this Solomonic tradition, personal histories foregoing African roots served to emphasize their Jewish heritage. A white Jewish visitor to the Commandment Keepers perceived such a concern when he told the New York Sun that only a minority of the congregants would admit not being Abyssinians. Indeed, it was usually observers like the visitor quoted above, an apparent Ashkenazic Jew named Shapiro, who elicited the most detailed genealogies from black Jewish subjects. The Jewish Daily News reported who visited Professor Richaliah of Moore Zionist Temple recorded Richaliah's catalog of the African natives of temple members. The Jewish Daily Forward ran a feature story on Vitella Valentine, the black Talmud Torah valedictorian, in which her family saga from Africa to Jamaica to Harlem was recounted at length. The very title of the article, the converted great-grandfather and the observant grandfather of the Negro girl of the Harlem Talmud Torah, signal its focus on family background, particularly with regards to Jewishness. As a Jewish academic anthropologist, Ruth Lades conducted fieldwork among the black Jewish congregations in which she questioned the leaders closely as to their origins and Jewish heritage. Significantly, of the various observers who left descriptions of black Jews, reporters for African American papers were the least inclined to probe the congregates' backgrounds. When these reporters noted black Jews' national origins, they presented the data in terse declarative sentences. Rabbi Ford comes from South America. More often, they omitted such details altogether. Continuing on to page 191. Yiddish papers lauded Jews who took black sides. They condemned racist Jews or Jews who exploited economically vulnerable blacks as having picked up certain un-Jewish ideas. Thus, editors instructed readers that American Jewishness meant a commitment to ethnical dealings with African Americans. Like blackface, anti-racist problematic or polemic was a means by which Jews identified themselves with blacks and secured their own fully American, hence white, status. These artistic and political developments of black Jewish identity took place within material context that also created tensions between the two groups. In the first decades of the 20th century, both European Jews and Southern African Americans migrated in large numbers to northern U.S. cities such as New York. Often they abutted or shared neighborhoods. This was the case in Harlem, which housed a Jewish community until the 1930s, when whites evacuated in the face of the African American influx. During the neighbors' transition in the 1910s and 1920s, the demographic changes fed friction between the two groups. Many Jews who had moved out retained title to Harlem properties and hence were pitied as economic competitors against African Americans to whom rented and sold. This relation fueled antipathies, black anti-Semitism, and Jewish racism that contradicted the political and cultural sympathies and identification between these two groups. One result of the antagonism appeared in the very newspaper that castigated unscrupulous Jewish proprietors who exploited blacks. Along with the sympathetic portrayals of African Americans and their struggle, Jewish papers ran frequent stories on blacks who robbed Jewish-owned businesses. They also reprinted sensational black crime stories. Mad Negro bites policeman who dies from the wire service. Such portrayals established a social economic distance between the two groups, even while editors urged them to build political unity. Several discourses and material currents then were stirring Jewish anxieties over racial status and closeness to African Americans. These anxieties helped frame Jewish reporters' ambivalently and probing attitude towards the idea that black people could be Jews. White Jewish observers showed concern not merely with the exotic nature of black Jewish congregants, but also with their authenticity as Jews. This theme emerged in one of the earliest accounts from the Michael Gold. After the Negro has been presented to Gold's family, he joins them for dinner. The meal quickly turns into a game of halakha, one-upsmanship. So, before sitting down to eat, the Negro Negro stranger washed his hands poisely and muttered a Hebrew prayer. Before each course that was served, he recited the proper Hebrew blessing. What an ultra-poised Jew! Reb Samuel and others came to witness this miracle. They questioned the stranger after supper. He proved to be a Tartar. Before the evening was over, he was quarreled with everyone. Harshly and firmly, he insisted that he was a better Jew than anyone present. He was an Abyssinian Jew, descended from the mating of King Solomon and Queen of Sheba. We others had wandered among the Gentiles, he said, and have been corrupted. But his people had been kept the faith pure. For instance, we prayed only at the morning and evening. His congregation prayed 4 times a day, and so on and so on. He was very dogmatic. He out-taught everyone. Reb Samuel was dumbfounded. My father hung his head in shame. At last, the Negro left haughtily, kissing the mezuzah again. By his manner, one could see he despised us all as black sliders, as mere pretenders to the proud title of a Jew. Gold's reading of the stranger's manner was probably right. Many black Jews did maintain that white Jews were inauthentic, that the Gold's dinner guest was able to assert his superior Jewishness. However, represented a dogmatic turning of tables. Originally, it was Ashkenazim who thought to interrogate the Negro. It was their questioning that started the quarrelsome exchange. Gold's neighbors were not alone in their interrogative impulse. For many white observers, black Jews' blackness did not answer but rather begged the question of authenticity. A more subtle example of this kind of questioning appears in the Jewish Daily Forward feature on Vertilla Valentine. The article opens with an account of Vertilla's achievement in leading her Talmud Torah class, and her family brimming pride in anticipation of her valedictory speech. But to understand fully the family's joy, we are told we must know the history behind it. Mr. Valentine, great-grandparents came from deep in Africa and all were Jews and conducted themselves as Jews should. When a boy was born to one of them, they circumcised him and gave him a Jewish name and raised him in Jewish belief. Indeed, the writer asserts, in Africa, the Valentines were known as der Vermisster Yiddish Neger Familie, the most observant Jewish Negro family. And after moving to the West Indies, however, they lapsed. Vertilla's great-grandfather became a Christian convert. It fell to the next generation, to Vertilla's grandfather Cain, to redeem his converted father's sin. After initial rejection and much perseverance, he gained conversion to Judaism through a Jamaican synagogue. His religious devotion grew to extremes. He was more poised than any born Jew. His pity thence became fanaticism. Cain's pity eventually landed him in jail on charges trumped up by Christians who resented his proselytizing. But he was released, and between 1918 and 1920, his family immigrated to New York. They carried on the edict handed down by Cain and never forget to tell their children that the Valentine family stemmed from the most observant Jewish Negro family in Africa. This article is genuinely sympathetic. It portrays the Valentines as sincere, resourceful people who touchingly, faithfully to the Jewish religion. At the same time, it shows a skeptical fascination with the black family's Jewishness. The distinct generation's observancy must be spelled out. They circumcised their male children, etc., even though the forward readers must certainly have known what observant Jewish life entailed. The story of intergenerational sin and redemption echoes biblical themes of Israel, repeated disobedience to and reconciliation with God, almost as thought this history had to be reenacted to be shared by blacks. The forward writer may have also implied his amusement when he repeated the phrase "der Vermisster Yiddish Neger Familie in Africa," as convention of humorous Yiddish fiction in this era marked utterance and comical by repeating them throughout the text at the ends of the sentence. The Yiddish reader might have inferred a humorous content to the phrase so placed. Yet the very need to say Jewish Negro family rather than simply Jewish family implied that the family's blackness was also problematic, something that placed into a separate category from Jewishness, as generally understood. A subtle mockery also tinged in 1929 Morgan Journal Tagblatt piece on Moorish Zionist fund drive, no less an ambition than making all African Jewish. That is the aim of the leaders of the Moorish Zionist congregation, a sect of black Jews who had a temple at 127 West 137th Street in Harlem. All right, so we're going to continue on to page 134. Well, actually, let's go back and continue to read down. The writer's opening phrase implies that the temple goal in grandiose he seems not to consider that some ambitions of Morgan's Journal, Orthodox white readers and such as the hasting of the Masonic Age through universal Jewish observancy, might seem equally fanciful. The account quickly switches to the scripture of the Moorish Zionist mundane needs $3,000 for a larger temple. Although the body of the piece expands on the congregation's theological of Ethiopian redemption, the closing idea is deluded dreamers. And meanwhile, the appointed time for that they struggle pathetically with great hardship to collect $3,000 for a bigger temple, and the movement cannot attract more than about 50 members. The questioning of the questioning of Jewishness in other reports was far less subtle. The forward writer who visited the Moorish Zionist temple told readers of the cognitive dissonance he experienced of meeting Professor Richalu. He was a Negro, no doubt, but wore a beard, a skull cap was on his head, his clothes were threadbare. In front of him lay a large quarto volume. It was a copy of the Marie Nestrum, Guide to the Perplexed, by the Namides, to be for sure. Mi Yidin Senin in Galuth. We are Jews in exile. The word startled me. They had a familiar ring. How often have I heard them from my father? But here, in the home of a Negro family, in Darkton? How strange. The story lingers on with this theme of surprise, noting with incredulity Rachaliah's perfect Yiddish and so forth. But interestingly, it changes tone. Zarwich, the reporter, starts to be swayed by Rachaliah's profession of Jewishness. He confesses, I admit that I came to mock, but I remain to sympathize. Rachaliah's passion and knowledge finally convinced him to the point of advocacy. There are black Jews in New York, genuine Orthodox Jews. This discovery spurs him to scholarly research, where he encounters a authority, Joseph Jacobs, and his famous work on the races of modern Jews. Jacobs, at the turn of the century, scholar of Jewish history, confirms the existence of African Jewry. But not all of the white observers shared Zarlot's openness to persuasion. Some spoke of the black Jews with condensed or full-brow racist stereotyping. One white Jewish critic was treacherous in a talk at a Long Island Jewish center in 1931. Dr. Salit declared the Negro synagogues were based on an admixture of superstition and ignorance that had nothing to do with Judaism. All right, again, this is what the white Jews thought of these black Jewish congregants. He described the Harlem temples as a grotesque phenomenon rising out of the mystic sensitivity of the African American, played upon the charlatans. The white Gentiles observers, all the less frequently interested in black Jews, caught purely equally in devious deceptions. In 1934, a writer from the national magazine Newsweek visited the Commandment Keepers and wrote a story designated to higher racial difference. Their forefathers were not among those whom Moses led safely through the retreating Red Sea, away from the pursuing Egyptians' wrath. Their skins were black as night. So during this time, because you had black Jews coming up on the scene and starting to gain notoriety, you had European Jews or white Jews, I guess you could say, trying to deny the fact. And one of the ways they did that was saying because they're black. They're black as night. There's no way they could be those people that came out of Egypt. All right? The assertion that black Jews did not share the Egyptian flight was important, given that centrally of the exodus to Jewish historical identity. By the article's end, these markers of racial alterity had developed into openly pejorative terms. Rabbi Matthew's day school to teach young pickaninnies Hebrew is close to his heart. Another white Jewish observer who embraced despairing stereotypes while conducting the most extensive study of black Jews in interwar period, Ruth Schlossberg Lanes, later a prominent anthropologist, was during the early 1930s a graduate student working under Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict at Columbia. Hearing of the Harlem congregation through a chance acquaintance, she undertook formal field work among them. Her resulting paper cast the group's leaders as pure charlatans and their followers as pathetic dupes who, bewildered and frightened as new arrivals in a big city, had stumbled towards various charismatic figures, including Marcus Garvey, Father Divine, and the black Jewish rabbis. Indeed, Lane's interviews revealed that several black Jewish leaders, including Arnold Ford and Mordecai Herman, had come out of Garvey's organization. Ford was said to have been expelled for challenging Garvey's leadership. All right, like Judaism, to some it was retreated of West Indian compatriots. To a few, it was a field for exploitation. To others, it was passing for show. To all, it offended status in a promised land. It failed because it was rooted in confusion. Lay's paper is a secular source, unlike other reportage by Jews. It was written for scholarly rather than a popular journal, and for a mixed rather than a Jewish audience. Based on extensive interviews, it offers valuable historical information such as the interwar histories of Ford, Herman, and Garvey, and the efforts of a number of local Ashkenazim to visit and tutor the black congregants. Yet in some ways the paper is of a piece with the Jewish press covered of the Harlem groups. Lays, with her prestigious academic credentials, approaching the black Jews with the same fascination regarding their origins that the Yiddish journalist displayed. Her research appears to have focused on pointing up the leaders' laborious autobiographical claims and documenting inauthentic creeds such as the belief that Jewish observance brought wealth. Although it does not necessarily belie all her conclusions about Ford and others leaders, Lay's prejudice towards black people is evident. Although she wrote sympathetic of black social and economic plight, she cast the ghetto residents as creatures who do not think but who stample. She also asserts that the New York de facto resident segregation, which imposed a several burden on blacks confined to crowd and crumble ghettos using a supported equally by most Negroes and whites. While charges of unorthodoxy could be informed by racism, they did sometimes gain credence from statements by the black Jews themselves. At least some congregants appear to be quite economical in their theology. The Commandment Keepers, who were visited in 1929 by Shapiro, the sympathetic Ashkenazic observer, incorporated a saxophone and English language hymns into their service. Moreover, they accepted Jesus. Some of the people accepted him, or as one of them, prophets of the ranks of Moses. Others of them, it seems, accepted him as divine. Morris Zionist Rabbi Herman was forthright about his wide embrace. He describes the movement as non-denominational and non-conform to be elaborate rituals and observances of Orthodox Jewry. One can be a Baptist and enjoy pork chops instead of kosher steaks if he chooses, the teacher said. Unity, brotherliness, aid for the needy, education in the Jewish language and economic practices were declared the keynotes of the movement. Such self-representations suggest that purity and orthodoxy were not priorities for all black Jews, or at least were not the leading concerns at all times. The tenet, or even the tenet that white Jews were not truly Jewish, appeared to have been inconsistently observed. Rabbi Matthew, the most vocal proponent of the black Jewish identity, told a reporter that his congregation patronized white Jewish butchers because there are no kosher butchers among the Commandment Keepers. Furthermore, black Jewish domestics sought observant white employers so that they couldn't work in kosher homes. These practices implored that black Jews accept the white Jewish observancy, if not white Jews themselves, as legitimate under Jewish law. But if black Jewish proponents sometimes suggested unorthodoxy, black Jews were more often eager to counter that charge. They were aware that outsiders questioned them and that they often spoke to those questions, whether explicitly or implicitly posed. In the forward interview, Professor Rachaliu was greatly agitated over white Jewish doubts. We are Jews, 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 he pounded the table. We are not Goyim. Here we live in a strange, unfriendly atmosphere. Our white brethren know us not. His concern was exacerbated by a running conflict between the fellows and a group of black Seventh-day Adventists. Paraphrasing Rachaliu, Zofwich wrote, some of the Negro Adventists seem to have discovered that the Jews of New York are sympathetic lot. Considerable numbers of them have become scorners. They go from house to house in Jewish sections, greet the house with a lusty Shalom Aleichem, Lebid Yadim, and ask for a donation. The Jewish housewife, thrilled at the sight of a black Jew, contributes liberally. Mordecai Herman and his group of real black Jews have had numerous quarrels with the Negro Adventists. I want to warn the Jews of New York, went on Rachaliu, not to be taken in by these Adventists partying as Jews. They can easily be unmasked. All that is necessary is to require them to write a receipt in Hebrew for a donation received. The members of Rabbi Herman's congregation are all of them versed in Hebrew lore and can write or speak in Hebrew or Aramaic. And right here on page 197 is where we will be ending up part 1 of the Black Jews of Harlem. All right, family, I hope you all enjoyed this read. I hope you all took notes. And again, if you all would like this source, the link will be in the bio. And of course, this video is pre-recorded. So again, I will see you all the next time I come on. Again, Shabbat Shalom, Todah for watching, and just stay tuned with the channel as we continue to grow, as we continue to bring out this information, and as we continue to evolve in this life. Shalom, shalom, and Todah for tuning in, family.